Every successful nation has to be based on more than a constitution and a body of law. There must be transcendental stories that unites citizens to an ethical as well as legal code. For the West, that was the Judeo-Christian story of the Bible. The biblical understanding of human sinfulness inspired the concept of limited state power or rule of law, emphasizing checks and balances to prevent tyranny, Isaiah 33:22. Governments are seen as instruments to maintain order and justice, but not as ultimate authorities. The belief that all humans are created in God's image, Genesis 1:27, underpins ideas of equal worth, human rights, and dignity for all individuals, including the poor and the neglected. Biblical teachings such as love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18, emphasizes care for others and fairness in governance. The Bible's distinction between God's sovereignty and earthly authority, Matthew 22:21, influenced the Western principle that the state should not overreach into matters of faith and conscience. Biblical ethics stress that rulers and citizens are accountable to a higher moral law, ensuring that government acts justly and protects the vulnerable, Romans 13:3-4. These principles collectively shaped Western values like democracy, human rights, and constitutional government. That is why my message to you today, and the message of Courage.media, is to stress that responsible citizenship in the West is inseparable from Christian morality. Please, let's aspire to build or restore the nation states on which our security depends. And let's ensure that they run as they used to on that Christian operating system without which we can have no moral compass. Thank you.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, to continue this theme of the choices that we face, we have our next speaker, who is going to speak to us, followed by a panel of John Anderson, Rod Dreher, Amy Orr-Ewing, and Neil Ferguson. Fresh on the off the plane, only just made it through the door, David Brooks.
So I have a confession to make. I'm a member of the educated elite. My parents were historians of Victorian England. Our turtles, when I was growing up, were named Disraeli and Gladstone. The culture in our home was think Yiddish, act British. Very stiff upper lip, we showed no emotion. And then when I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided I wanted to become a writer. And that was central to my identity ever since. In high school, which you call like fourth form or something like that, I wanted to date a woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She dated some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so those were my values. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown universities decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And some of you may know the saying about Chicago, it's where fun goes to die. My favorite saying about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so it's very educated elite. And I fit right in. I had a double major at Chicago in history and celibacy while I was there. And then after school, I got a job where an educated elite person should get a job. I was hired to be the conservative columnist of the New York Times, a job I likened to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there. And then I got a job on PBS, which is our PBS NewsHour, which is our version of Newsnight. And again, educated elite. We have a wonderful audience, somewhat seasoned. And so if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me at the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your program, but my mother loves it. So we members of the educated elite did some good things. We created the internet brunch and mocktails. You're welcome. We did some bad things. We designed a meritocracy designed around the skills we ourselves possess and rigged the game so we succeeded and everybody else failed. By age 12, American children of affluent kids are 4 grade levels above everybody else. By university age, rich kids are 77 times more likely to go to university or to Ivy League university than kids from poor schools. In adulthood, 54% of the people at elite workplaces went to the same 34 elite colleges. So we ended up creating a caste system. People with high school degrees die 9 years sooner than people with college degrees. People with high school degrees are 5 times more likely to have kids out of wedlock. People with high school degrees are 2.4 times more likely to say they have no friends. So we created a caste system, even though we pretend to be egalitarian. But the worst things we did were not material. America has a very strong economy. The worst things we did were spiritual. We privatized morality and destroyed the moral order. George Marsden is a great historian who said, what gave Martin Luther King's rhetoric its power was the sense there's a moral order built into the universe. That if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. If segregation is not wrong, nothing is wrong. We took that essential moral order that holds people together, and we decided it's up to you to find your own truth, find your own values. Back in 1955, a great American journalist named Walter Lippmann understood this was going to be a big problem. He said, if what is right and wrong depends on what each individual feels, then we are outside the bounds of civilization. And so, without a strong moral order, it's hard to have trust. It's hard to find your meaning in life. And so America, and I think Britain too, has become a sadder society. Rise in mental health, rise in suicide. 45% of high school students say they are persistently hopeless and despondent. Since 2000, the number of Americans without close personal friends is up by 4-fold. Since 2000, the number of people who say they are in the lowest happiness category is up by 50%. We've just become sadder. The third thing the educated elite has done, and this may not please you, is we produced Donald Trump. Some people think Donald Trump is a populist. Donald Trump and Elon Musk went to the University of Pennsylvania and Ivy League school and became billionaires. J.D. Vance went to Yale. Pete Hegseth went to Princeton and Yale. Stephen Miller went to Duke. Fox News types like Laura Ingraham went to Dartmouth. And they represent the educated elite. And the key factor of the educated elite is that they're not pro-conservative, they're anti-left. They don't have a positive vision, a conservative vision for society. They just want to destroy the institutions that the left now dominates. And this means, in the first place, they're astoundingly incompetent. I have a lot of sympathy with what drove people to vote for Trump, but I am telling you, as someone who's on the front row to what's happening, do not hitch your wagon to that star. Thank you. You're supposed to boo. Pete Hegseth gave away our bargaining chips with Putin before we even had negotiations. Elon Musk has 25-year-olds firing people who are controlling our nuclear codes. It's like Sam Bankman-Fried got control of our nuclear arsenal. Second, elite narcissism causes them to eviscerate every belief system they touch. Conservatives believe in healthy societies are built on healthy institutions. They're anti-institutionals. Conservatives believe in steady and gradual change, Edmund Burke. They're disruption. Conservatives believe in constitutional government. Donald Trump says, I alone can fix this. Conservatives believe in moral norms. They're destroying moral norms. The other belief system that they are destroying is Judeo-Christian faith. Judeo-Christian faith is based on service to the poor, service to the immigrant, service to the stranger. I went to Namibia, South Africa throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and I watched people die of AIDS. Then I went back with my friend Mike Gerson, and I saw those 25 million lives saved. I saw people living lives of dignity. And so what's the first thing Donald Trump did? He eviscerated that program. My friends in America are conservative evangelicals in government who want to fight sex trafficking, poverty. They want to preserve national security. Donald Trump is declaring war on those Christians. So I've described three different things we educated elites brought you. We destroyed the social fabric through inequality. We destroyed the moral fabric through privatizing morality. And we destroyed the institutional fabric, what's happening right now. How can we come back? Well, we already are. I often ask people, tell me about a time that made you who you are as a human being. And they never say, I went on a fantastic vacation in Hawaii. They never say that. They say, I went through a really hard time. The death of someone, the loss of someone, moving away from home, entering a new vocation. Paul Tillich, the theologian, said those moments of suffering interrupt your life and they remind you you're not the person you thought they were. They carve through the floor of your basement of your soul, and they reveal a cavity below, and they carve through that floor, and they reveal a cavity below. In moments of suffering, you see yourself in a more deep way than you ever did before. And in those moments of suffering, you can either be broken or you can be broken open. And people who are transformed decide, I'm going to be broken open. And nations that are going to be transformed by moments of suffering say, we're going to be broken open. We've been through periods of national crisis before. Across the world, nations have constantly hit a spiritual and cultural crisis and then revives. This country between 1820 and 1848. I was here in the 1980s. Britain recovered in the 1980s. Australia in the 1970s, Germany and Japan after World War II, South Korea in the 1980s, Rwanda after 1994, Chile in the 1990s. My own country, we've done this again and again. We've grown not through a happy, merry ride. We've grown through a process of rupture and repair when society and culture is in crisis and we figure it out. 1770s, the old colonial order had to go. Sorry. 1830s, the East Coast elite had too much power. Andrew Jackson brought in an era of populism. 1860s, the slavery order had to go. Abraham Lincoln brought forth national redemption. 1890s, we had failed at industrialization. We had a civic renaissance of all these civic organizations that filled in the hole and created a sane society. 1960s, the conformist culture of the 1950s had to go. And we had the changes that came there. The temptation of those who don't read history is to think this time is different. We're in another period of rupture and repair. We have spiritual resources. I'm a conservative. I believe that we are inheritors of a great spiritual legacy, what Michael Oakeshott called the Great Conversation. We have the voice of Genesis, that we're all made in God's image. That's the foundation of democracy. We have the voice of Exodus, that we wander through the wilderness and eventually get to the promised land. We have the voice of Jesus, even if you're not Christian. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit. That's a source of great strength. In my country, we have the voice of Alexander Hamilton. Poor boys and girls should rise and succeed. We have the voice of Edmund Burke, that we should be modest about what we can know because culture is really complicated and we should operate on society the way we would operate on our Father, gradually and carefully. We have the voice of John Stuart Mill. We value diversity and pluralism because it leads to what he called adventures in living. When you have a spiritual, moral, and relational crisis, the job is to shift the culture. And we are moving, I think, from a hyper-individualistic culture the last 60 years toward a communal culture. I didn't like the social justice movement, but it was an attempt to find community. I'm not particularly a big fan of MAGA, but it's an attempt to find community. Culture change is about a shifting of the heart. It's about providing new answers to the question, how should I live my life? It's about soulcraft. And it isn't done the way you do political change. Culture change works differently. It's done, as Walter Bagehot put it, if you want to win people over, enjoy the things that conservatives enjoy. Culture changes when a creative minority find a beautiful way to live. Culture changes when a small group of people find a better way to live and the rest of us copy. That's the story of the early church. It's the story of the Clapham sect. They weren't my cup of tea, but it's the story of Bloomsbury. I was mentored by William F. Buckley. It's the story of the conservative movement in America. Culture changes on a personal level when we relate to each other with attentive and generous gaze. Simone Weil said, attention is the purest form of generosity. Culture changes on a spiritual level. T.S. Eliot said, you can't create a system so perfect that the people in it don't have to be good. It's when you put moral formation at the center of your society. And finally, it happens at the civic level, when 1,000 voices and 1,000 different organizations create civic institutions that provide healing and relationship in society. That's how culture changes. I was at a bar about 2 months after October 7th. And if you had seen me there, you would have thought, sad guy drinking alone. I call it reporting. So I'm scrolling through Twitter, and it has all these brutal images from the Middle East. But I come across a video of James Baldwin, and he says, you know, there isn't as much humanity as one would like, but there's enough. And what you've got to remember is that when you walk down the street, every person you meet, you could be that person. That could be you. You could be that monster. You could be that saint. And you have to decide who you're going to be. Now, James Baldwin was treated shabbily by my society because of his race and other things. But he had a right to be bitter. But even in that circumstance, he uttered the ultimate humanist statement. You could be that person could be you. And the phrase that rang in my head when I heard that was defiant humanism. That even in harsh and brutal times, we're called upon to see each other in the fullest, deepest, and most respectful way that God imagined that they would be seen. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to bring out John Anderson, Neil Ferguson, Amy Orr Ewing, and Rod Dreher, assuming they show up. They're boycotting me. Okay, I will now ask myself questions. Oh, here they are.
I guess you're off J.D. Vance's Christmas card.
That happened long ago. Neil, we're going to start with you. You're the historian of the bunch. Talk about national uplift, times countries have revived themselves, times offer us some hope.
Well, David, I enjoyed your comments, and of course I'm obliged to say that I enjoyed my wife's comments even more. And my fellow Scotsman, Douglas Murray, was good too. And he's always brilliant. As I listened to these three outstanding speeches, which touched on morality, on God, on how culture changes, I kept reflecting on the role that war has played in the past, in causing national resurgences and national collapses. And your thoughts, your remarks, put me in mind of Tolstoy. Tolstoy's War and Peace is the story of ordinary people trying to live their private lives, and they have their private lives turned upside down by war. And that has been the experience of friends of mine in Israel. It has been the experience of friends of mine in Ukraine. But for most people in this auditorium, in this country, and in the United States, that's a very distant, remote experience. I have to think back to my grandfathers to understand what it's like for war to strike at the very heart of Britain. And you have the same. So a lot of what we talk about in these contexts is, from a historian's point of view, detached from the reality that it's very often the shock of war that brings about the biggest transformations, revivals or collapses of national culture. So that's the thing that sometimes gets left out of these conversations in the United States. You spoke semi-ironically, disparagingly about American elites. But American elites helped win World War II. It was American elites who built the capabilities that defeated the dark forces of National Socialism. And it was British elites who also contributed to that great victory in 1945. So let's remember, before we slag off the elites, that they played a key part in preserving Western civilization. I'll say one more thing. When I'm trying to educate my children, who are even further away than I am from that experience of conflict, of war and peace, I try to get them to read the literature that will inform them of that searing experience. And if you can't get them to read the literature, then at least get them to watch Rogue Heroes, SAS, one of the best television series I've seen in ages. And the spirit of David Sterling I find terribly uplifting. That spirit that created the special forces, the spirit that said, we're simply going to break the rules and get in behind the enemy lines and completely bugger up the way they fight this war. It's terribly inspiring to be reminded that we British, indeed we Scots, came up with the completely mad idea of the SAS. But that's the spirit, the real spirit of Western civilization that will never, I think, die as long as we remember that our civilization was built in the crucible of war.
Okay. Amy, what are the spiritual resources we have that you see to tap into?
I think we're living at a time of real spiritual thirst in the West. The studies suggest that Generation Z are much more likely to be spiritual and open to the idea of God than their parents. And I think the Judeo-Christian worldview has two really powerful and wonderful things to offer this generation that have sustained our civilization. The first we've talked about a lot at the conference, the idea of being created in the image of God. God within the Bible is not an idea. God is in actuality a person. And so to be created in the image of God is to have extraordinary dignity and value. And that, to a generation that have been raised being told your identity is, dependent on yourself, you have to generate it yourself, and your identity is defined by intersectional injustice, and then you're propelled by grievance into this world. What a contrast to view yourself and other human beings as sacred image bearers of a living God who we can have connection with. And I think the second most powerful idea is the idea of redemption, the possibility of grace and a second chance, the possibility of forgiveness. My grandparents came to this country in 1948, escaping Soviet occupation. They landed with my father and my aunt at RAF Northolt in the clothes they were standing up in. They had experienced the horrors of the Nazis and then of the Soviets. As a generation, they knew the reality of evil, the darkness in the human heart potentially. The Bible talks about the fall as a real category. So we've been created in the image of God, but every single person also is wrestling with sin and darkness. And so what the Judeo-Christian framework gives us is this possibility of redemption, a new start, a fresh start. And that isn't just about an individual connection with our Creator, although it is about that, and what a wonderful way to live, with attachment to a loving God as the core of our being. But it also propels people's lives for good. You know, the parable that Jesus is most famous for, the Good Samaritan, is cited all the time as a kind of example of why we should do good and love our neighbour. But the earliest thinkers in the church, the patristic writers, realized that the central character of the Good Samaritan was Jesus himself. And what he was essentially saying is to be human is to feel like being beaten up and left at the side of the road to die. And we all need rescue, we need forgiveness, we need deliverance, we need help from outside, we need redemption. And once we've experienced that, we can rebuild our world. We can love neighbor. We can do prison reform. We can care for the poorest. We can create systems that reflect a loving God and the value of every human being created in his image. And all of us have the possibility of a second chance. Businesses, when we fail, we can get up and start again. We can create wealth through this power of redemption and forgiveness.
Okay, thank you. Rod and I have been friends for years. We disagree about Donald Trump. We disagree about J.D. Vance. We probably disagree about Viktor Orban. But
Yeah, I think we
the friendship we have is one of the ones I value because of that disagreement. Your books, going back to the Dante book, Benedict option, the current book on enchantment, they're part cultural critique, but really the things I found personally most valuable is spiritual uplift and a spiritual path. So if I could ask you to talk about that part of your work.
Yeah, my work in recent years has been about trying to save civilization, broadly considered, but the meaning crisis is at the heart of of our civilizational struggle, and the meaning crisis is ultimately a religious crisis. And I don't believe that we can solve this problem by simply, returning to some past that is irrecoverable. And we can't solve it either by arranging our thoughts in the correct way. Marshall McLuhan said that there are two ways of perceiving things. Well, you have percept, which is truth that you perceive, and concept, which is what happens in the left brain. When religion becomes concept, it begins to die.
Yeah.
So I think the real challenge for us today in this dying civilization is to reconnect to our ancestral faith, Christianity or Judaism, and to do so in a visceral way, a direct way. One of the real prophets of our time is a psychiatrist named Ian McGilchrist. I've seen him around here today. And Dr. McGilchrist has a theory of culture based on brain hemispheres. He said that in the left hemisphere is the analytic side, the right hemisphere is, of course, the perceptive side. The problem with the West, he says, is that at the beginning of the modern age, we leaned very heavily into the left hemisphere because it gave us power. Someone yesterday quoted Yuval Noah Harari saying, we exchanged meaning for power at the beginning of the modern period. And that has made us all rich and technologically advanced and all the good things. But Dr. McGilchrist says it has left us utterly bereft spiritually, creatively, and so forth. And we're not going to see recovery until and unless we achieve balance. So what I write about in Living in Wonder, my new book on re-enchantment, by re-enchantment, I don't mean sprinkling little Disney fairy dust somewhere and creating Disney World. I mean rather establishing a visceral connection to transcendent values and ultimately to the living God. There are ways we can do that. We have done that in this civilization. And so, and there are practical things we can do too. I think of what Pope Benedict XVI said, that the best arguments for Christianity in this time are not the propositional arguments. That's made for an age of reason, but rather the art the church produces and the saints. By which he means you see these principles embodied materially in art, in music, things like that, and also in goodness, radical goodness, holiness of the saints. These things speak to the heart, and the heart can't deny them. And what they do, once you take this into your heart, it opens a mind up for the propositions. I think that we are not going to recover until and unless we become re-enchanted and seek a form of Christianity and indeed of Judaism that is more mystical, that valorizes this direct perception of the Holy Spirit, of holiness, and of transcendence. And I also think that this is where the Benedict option idea comes in. It is not, please God, about heading for the hills. There are no hills to head to. It is about forming small communities. They can be schools, they can be church communities, they can be any number of things where people who share a common faith practice spiritual disciplines together so that when they go out into the world, as we all must unless we're called to the monastery, we can faithfully represent Jesus Christ and bring him and the gospel to the world. So I think, David, to conclude, that we are desperate for meaning. And that meaning is there. Our ancestors in the pre-modern period knew it. And my general idea is that if we can return to a pre-modern form of Christianity, what the Anglican theologian Hans Boersma calls the great tradition, then we have a chance of doing that. It's not going to happen overnight. This is not a quick fix. And it's certainly not something that can happen only by politics. Our old friend Viktor Orban once said that I can't give you meaning as a politician. I can give you things, meaning I can give subsidies, I can create laws that allow these other institutions to flourish. But if civil society doesn't step up, if each one of us do not step up within our little platoons or in our families and so forth, then anything politics and economics might accomplish for us are in vain.
Thank you. I should say I ordered Ian McGilchrist's new book, which is the 2-volume, great big tomes from Amazon, and somebody stole volume 1 off my driveway, which shows the hunger for epistemology in Washington, D.C.
And it probably strained his back carrying it away.
John, Ron was just talking about the role politics can and cannot play. You, unlike the rest of us, have served in political office. How do you think about politics in a time like this?
David, thank you. A couple of days before I came over, with my mind on higher things like ARC in London, and if I really got to go there in the dead of winter and put up with the jet lag and what have you, I absent-mindedly filled my farm ute, we'd call it in Australia, truck you'd call it in America, with the wrong fuel. You'll get the point straight away. I put diesel in a petrol vehicle. And as the vehicle, as I drove off down the road, started to absorb the wrong fuel, it started initially to, it still ran, but there was actually, as it happened, grey smoke going everywhere. It became less and less powerful and then died on the side of the road. And you think, well, this is very inconvenient, and I wonder what this is going to cost me, because I've probably done a lot of damage, etc., etc. How bad is it all going to be? The amazing thing was that we drained the dead fuel out of it, or the wrong fuel out of it, and refueled it with the right fuel. A lot of British engineering in that vehicle, so amazingly it started and ran perfectly. Now the point is, out of that we should not be overly despairing. The reality is that our forefathers have visited upon us the institutions of freedom, that just like that motor car, the engine was still there, the wheels were still there, the gearbox was still there, put the right fuel in it, it all started to work again. And as Neil has just said, of course we need elites. You've got to have elites. Someone's got to lead. Somebody's got to be highly enough educated to lead in the field of medicine. Somebody's got to be gifted enough to actually lead and inspire in the area of theology. Somebody's got to be good enough to inspire a nation. Think of Britain in the 30s, the Oxford Pledge. Under no circumstances will this House fight for king and country. Passed overwhelmingly. A few short years ago, under strong leadership, the young people of this nation were fighting for the very survival of everything that matters. It's a remarkable story. You've written about, well, lots of you have written about it probably. Those institutions can be resurrected with the right people. Point 2. Have you noticed how many remarkable young people have come here to ARC in London? I've had the opportunity and the privilege and the horribly difficult task of helping decide who gets to sit around a cabinet table. I've met people here who have all of the ability necessary to make up competent cabinets. Well, how about you give some thought to stepping up, to making the sacrifices involved, because we need you. And I'm always deeply torn when a young person of real ability, plenty of them with no little ability, and I say, go away, it's not for you, real ability, who say, I'm interested in politics, I want to serve, because it's not fun. But on the other hand, it's the battlefront. If you're involved in culture, well, you've got to be prepared to be involved. You have to step up. You've got to be looking for the opportunities. Third point. You've seen many wonderful examples of people who have gone out on a limb, who have displayed great courage, who have done deep thinking, and they've come here today. I mean, I don't want to be sort of create a hierarchy here, but I thought what Ayaan Hirsi Ali has done in recent times has been remarkable. What an example. What an example of courage. And tomorrow it'll be a great privilege for me to see on the stage, and you will meet somebody well known to Australians, perhaps not so well known outside yet, a very dear friend of mine, Peter Costello. We served in the Parliament of Australia together for roughly 2 decades. That man had a highly successful legal career and every reason to pursue his own self-interests, but he gave it up for the grind of politics. He presided over 11 budgets in Australia where we managed completely to pay down all Commonwealth debt and leave a surplus in the bank. That's reform. That's ending intergenerational theft. That's building a platform for tomorrow's kids and for our grandchildren. You'll hear from him tomorrow. There are examples everywhere, but take note of him. He didn't have to do it, but he did. And I'll just make 2 points about, because I served with him on what we called the Razor Gang for years. Woe betide anybody who walked through the room, any minister saying, I've got this great new program, and he'd say, this looks like rent-seeking to me, and the minister would say, no, it's not rent-seeking, and Peter would say, yes, it is, and for these reasons you're not getting it. But equally, justice and fairness. Woe betide a minister who came in with a proposal for saving money that would have hit somebody genuinely in need. That distinction's terribly, terribly important. So let's not give up. The machine is still operable. The institutions of freedom that our grandparents gave us, with the right fuel, with the right elites, with the right people motivated by the right, if you like, spirituality, for want of a better word, we can recapture freedom. It's not too late. So you young people, be encouraged, but be challenged as well.
Okay. Right. We're out of time. Neil, John, Amy, and Rod, thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave.
This session, we've got one more speaker to come on the choice to renew and the cost if we don't. Os Guinness's clarity of thinking on this issue is remarkable. Please welcome him to the stage now.
When we met at the first ARC conference, it was only days after the barbaric Hamas attack on Israel. A day after the attack itself, I was in Mike Johnson's office. He was not then the speaker, and he was expecting to be here. And there was the first of the big protests in Washington. What was clear, this was planned. And of course, since then, we've seen the incredible convergence between radical Islamism, long planned by Hitler and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem back in 1941, and radical Marxism in its cultural Marxist form, and the product of the 1967 call for a long march through the institutions. And what we've seen since 2023 is that fateful convergence of these two radicalisms, and the point is that they were against the Christian faith and Judaism, but they are also entirely hostile to the West. In other words, the alternatives are within our gates.